Nobody at Copper Canyon Precision Range expected the quiet woman picking up empty brass casings to deliver a shot that would shatter every assumption they had about her. What happened next didn't just silence the range, it rewrote everything they thought they knew about hidden talent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Riley Santos pulled her weathered Ford pickup into the dusty parking lot of Copper Canyon Precision Range, the engine giving one final cough before settling into silence. The truck's faded blue paint and rust spots stood in stark contrast to the gleaming fleet of luxury SUVs, custom-wrapped shooting vehicles, and pristine diesel trucks that dominated the lot. Each vehicle seemed to cost more than Riley made in 2 years at her current job, stocking shelves at the local hardware store. She sat for a moment, hands gripping the cracked steering wheel, watching through her windshield as groups of well-dressed shooters emerged from their expensive rides. They moved with the confident swagger of people accustomed to having the best of everything, from their pristine tactical clothing adorned with sponsor patches to custom rifle cases that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The conversations carried across the lot, filled with technical jargon about ballistic coefficients, custom loads, and equipment modifications that sounded like a foreign language to most people. Riley's reflection stared back at her from the side mirror, tired brown eyes set in a face that had seen too much, framed by dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup, no fancy shooting attire, just a worn flannel shirt over faded jeans and work boots that had seen better days. The only hint of her military past was a small, barely visible scar along her jawline, and the way she held herself, straight-backed, despite the exhaustion that seemed to permeate her bones. The job posting had been simple enough. Range maintenance assistant needed. Part-time work, must be reliable. It wasn't glamorous, but Riley needed the money. Since leaving the Army 2 years ago, steady work had been hard to come by. Her veterans benefits helped, but they weren't enough to cover both rent and groceries, especially not after the medical bills from her last deployment had piled up. This job would mean picking up spent brass casings, cleaning target frames, and doing whatever other grunt work the Copper Canyon Precision Range needed done. As she stepped out of her truck, the Arizona heat hit her like a physical wall. The range sprawled before her across the desert landscape, a testament to serious money and serious shooting. Multiple covered firing lines extended toward targets at various distances, with the farthest visible markers stretching impossibly far into the desert haze. This wasn't some local gun club where weekend warriors came to plink at paper targets. This was where precision shooting athletes trained, where world records were broken, where sponsors scouted talent. Riley shouldered her small backpack containing little more than a water bottle, a granola bar, and her work gloves, and walked toward the main building. The structure itself was impressive, modern architecture with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the desert and firing lines. Inside, she could see the gleam of polished concrete floors and what looked like a pro shop filled with equipment that probably cost more than most people's cars. A group of shooters walked past her, their conversation animated with excitement about some upcoming competition. "Did you see Garrett's group yesterday? Sub-MOA at 2,000 meters. The man's a machine. No wonder he's got 3 equipment sponsors now. Adrienne's not far behind. Her new setup with that custom barrel is just nasty. I heard she's shooting half MOA groups consistently at 1,500. Riley recognized the names from internet forums and shooting magazines. Garrett Hayes and Adrienne Walsh were legends in the long-range precision shooting world. The kind of shooters that appeared on covers of magazines and commanded 5-figure appearance fees at competitions. The fact that they trained here explained the caliber of vehicles in the parking lot and the obvious wealth on display. The main entrance featured heavy glass doors with the Copper Canyon logo etched in gold, a mountain peak overlaid with crosshairs. As Riley approached, she could see inside to a reception area that looked more like a luxury hotel lobby than a shooting range. Leather furniture, polished stone surfaces, and display cases filled with custom rifles that gleamed under perfect lighting. She paused at the threshold, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked. Through the windows, she could see the staff moving with professional efficiency, all wearing matching polo shirts with the facility logo, looking like they belonged in this world of precision and perfection. Riley glanced down at her reflection in the glass, seeing a tired woman in work clothes who clearly didn't belong among the elite. But she needed this job. She needed the money, and she needed to start somewhere in building back her life after the military. Taking a deep breath, Riley pulled open the heavy glass door and stepped into the air-conditioned coolness of Copper Canyon Precision Range. The reception area was even more impressive from inside. The polished concrete floors reflected the recessed lighting perfectly, and the walls featured framed photographs of the range's notable achievements: world records set, champions trained, precision shooting milestones reached. Behind the curved reception desk, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and flawless makeup looked up from her computer screen.
"Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but clearly questioning why someone like Riley would be walking into a place like this. "I'm here about the maintenance job," Riley said quietly, her voice carrying just a hint of the authority that had once commanded respect from soldiers under her command. "I called yesterday about the position." The receptionist, her name tag read Natalie, looked Riley up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "Oh, right, the maintenance thing." She typed something into her computer, frowning slightly. "Vincent's probably out on the range somewhere. Let me call him." While Natalie made the call, Riley looked around the reception area more carefully. The trophy cases contained awards from precision shooting competitions around the world, many bearing the names of shooters she recognized from military sniper competitions she'd once participated in. Photos on the walls showed groups of smiling athletes holding custom rifles worth more than most people's annual salaries. "He'll be right in," Natalie said, hanging up the phone. "You can wait over there." She gestured toward a seating area near the windows overlooking the main firing line. Riley settled into one of the leather chairs, trying not to think about how her work boots looked against the pristine floor. Through the windows, she could see the firing line in action. Shooters lay prone behind enormous rifles mounted on sophisticated bipods and rear supports, their positions textbook perfect as they engaged targets at distances that seemed impossible. Even from inside the building, she could occasionally hear the distinctive crack of high-powered precision rifles sending bullets toward targets measured in thousands of meters rather than hundreds. A few minutes later, a tall man in his 50s approached from the direction of the range. His gray hair was cut military short, and his bearing suggested either law enforcement or military background. His polo shirt stretched across broad shoulders, and his handshake, when he introduced himself as Vincent McCarthy, Rangemaster, was firm without being aggressive. "You're here about the maintenance position?" Vincent asked, his eyes taking in Riley's appearance with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to sizing people up rapidly. "Yes, sir," Riley replied, the military courtesy coming automatically. Vincent's eyebrows raised slightly at the "sir," but he didn't comment on it. "It's pretty straightforward work. Brass pickup, target maintenance, general cleanup. Hours are flexible, but we need someone reliable. It's not glamorous." "I'm looking for honest work, not glamour," Riley said simply. Something in her tone made Vincent look at her more carefully. "You served?" "Army, 8 years." Vincent nodded slowly. "What kind of work?" Riley hesitated for just a moment. "Infantry. Some specialized training." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Her specialized training had included advanced marksmanship courses that very few soldiers ever received, but that seemed irrelevant now. She was here to pick up brass casings and clean targets, not to discuss her past. "Well, the work's honest, and we pay fair. When can you start?" "Today, if you need me to." Vincent smiled for the first time since meeting her. "I like that attitude. Come on. Let me show you around and get you started." Vincent led Riley through a corridor lined with more trophy cases and photographs of championship events. The walls seemed to chronicle decades of precision shooting excellence, each image a testament to the level of skill that called Copper Canyon home. As they walked, Riley could hear the rhythmic crack of rifle fire from the outdoor ranges,
punctuated by the occasional celebratory shout when someone made a particularly impressive shot. "This is our main pro shop," Vincent said, gesturing through glass doors at a retail space that looked more like a high-end jewelry store than a gun shop. Custom rifles were displayed in climate-controlled cases, their price tags discreetly placed, but visible enough for Riley to catch glimpses of numbers that made her stomach clench. 20,000, 35,000. One rifle bore a tag reading, "Custom build, $47,500. She quickly looked away. "Your main duties will be brass collection and target maintenance," Vincent continued, seemingly oblivious to Riley's shock at the prices. "We go through a lot of ammunition here, especially during training camps and competitions. The brass needs to be sorted by caliber and cleaned before we send it out for reloading. It's detail work, but important." They passed a lounge area where several shooters were gathered around a large table covered with ballistic charts and laptop computers. Riley recognized the type immediately, the kind of meticulous preparation that separated amateur enthusiasts from serious competitors. They were discussing wind patterns, atmospheric conditions, and ammunition lots with the intensity of scientists planning a space mission. "That's some of our regular talent," Vincent said, lowering his voice slightly. "Garrett Hayes is the tall one with the buzz cut, 3-time national champion in precision rifle. Adrienne Walsh is the redhead. She holds 2 world records in women's long-range shooting. The others are sponsors, coaches, and support staff." Riley nodded, trying to appear appropriately impressed while fighting off memories of her own competition days when such conversations had been second nature to her. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, before everything had changed, before she'd decided that some doors were better left closed. Vincent pushed through a set of double doors that led directly onto the firing line. The heat hit them immediately, but it was the scope of the operation that truly impressed Riley. The firing positions stretched out in both directions, each equipped with concrete shooting benches, overhead shade structures, and sophisticated target systems. But it was the distances that took her breath away. She could see target markers stretching out to what had to be nearly 3 miles into the desert. "We've got positions out to 4,000 meters, Vincent said, following her gaze. "It's one of the longest civilian ranges in the country. We host several major competitions here each year, including the Desert Precision Challenge." Riley nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite her racing pulse. 4,000 meters. She hadn't shot at that distance since her final qualification course in the military, a test that fewer than 50 people had passed in the past decade. "Your main duties will be brass collection and target maintenance," Vincent continued, leading her to a small building positioned between the firing line and the target areas. Inside, she found a modest setup, a desk, some basic tools, and large bins labeled for different calibers of brass casings. Pretty straightforward. Collect brass from the firing line after sessions, sort it by caliber, clean it if needed. Target maintenance involves replacing torn targets, checking frame integrity, and reporting any issues with the electronic scoring systems. He handed her a pair of work gloves and a small utility vehicle key. "That ATV outside is yours to use for getting around the range. It's a big property, and walking everywhere would take forever." As Vincent explained the basic procedures, Riley could hear voices approaching from outside. Through the small window, she watched as Garrett Hayes and Adrienne Walsh walked toward nearby firing positions, their conversation animated with technical details about their upcoming training session. "I told you that new barrel is worth every penny," Garrett was saying, carrying a rifle case that probably weighed more than Riley's entire monthly grocery budget. "The consistency at extreme range is just unreal." "We'll see," Adrienne replied with a competitive edge to her voice. "My new setup might have something to say about that. The ballistic computer integration alone should give me an edge in variable conditions." They were followed by 2 other men whom Riley didn't recognize, but their expensive gear and confident bearing marked them as serious competitors. Vincent noticed her watching and lowered his voice slightly. "That's some of our regular talent. The competition between those 2 drives half the innovation in long-range shooting. When they're both shooting well, they push each other to levels most people can't even comprehend." Riley nodded, politely, but inside she was fighting a familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety. Being around this level of shooting again brought back memories she'd tried to bury. Memories of her own competitions, her own records, and the career she'd had walked away from. "Any questions about the work?" Vincent asked. "No, sir. Seems straightforward enough." "Good. I'll leave you to it then. First day is mostly getting familiar with the layout and procedures. Don't feel like you need to tackle everything at once." After Vincent left, Riley stood alone in the small maintenance building, looking out at the sprawling range complex. Through the window, she could see Garrett and Adrian setting up their rifles at the 1,500-meter line, their movements practiced and efficient. Other shooters were scattered across various distances, each focused on their own training goals. She pulled on the work gloves and headed outside to begin her first brass collection run. The firing line showed the evidence of a busy morning. Spent casings glittered in the desert sun like scattered coins. Riley began working methodically, using a small collection tool to gather the brass and sort it into appropriate containers on the ATV. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice the quality of equipment around her. Custom rifles worth more than cars rested on bipods that cost more than her monthly rent. Spotting scopes that could resolve bullet holes at impossible distances sat beside ballistic computers that looked like something from a science fiction movie. "Excuse me," a voice called from behind her. Riley turned to see one of the men who'd been with Garrett and Adrian, a heavy-set man wearing a shooting vest covered in sponsor patches. His expression was mildly annoyed, as if her presence was somehow inconvenient. "You're the new maintenance girl?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he already knew the answer. "Maintenance assistant," Riley corrected gently. "Right, well, Connor Morrison?" he said, extending a hand in a way that seemed more obligatory than friendly. "I'm training here for the next few weeks. Just want to make sure the brass collection doesn't interfere with our session timing." Riley noted. "I'll work around your schedule. No problem." Connor looked her up and down, taking in her simple work clothes and obvious lack of expensive gear. "First time around serious long-range shooting?" "I'll stay out of your way," Riley replied, deflecting the question. "Good. Some of us are preparing for competitions that matter. Distractions can be expensive." He turned away without waiting for a response, returning to his rifle setup with the dismissive air of someone accustomed to being catered to. Riley continued her work, trying to ignore the sting of condescension. She'd dealt with worse in the military, and she needed this job. As she moved between firing positions, collecting brass, and checking target frames, she found herself inadvertently analyzing the shooting she observed. Old habits died hard, and her trained eye automatically assessed techniques, equipment choices, and shot patterns. By the end of her first day, Riley had settled into the rhythm of her new role. She was invisible to most of the shooters, just part of the range infrastructure that kept things running smoothly. It was humble work, but honest work, and it put her in the middle of a world she'd once dominated, but now observed from the shadows. As she loaded her collected brass into the sorting bins, Riley caught herself studying the ballistic data sheets that some shooters had left behind. Distance calculations, wind corrections, ammunition specifications, all familiar territory that made her fingers itch for a rifle of her own. But that life was behind her now. She was just the maintenance assistant, invisible and overlooked, exactly how she preferred it. At least, that's what she told herself. Over the following weeks, Riley settled into a routine that made her practically invisible to the elite shooters who dominated Copper Canyon. She arrived each morning before the heat became unbearable, systematically collecting brass from the previous day's sessions and preparing the range for another day of precision shooting excellence. The work was meditative in its simplicity, allowing her to observe the intricate world of competitive long-range shooting while remaining safely in the background. She learned the rhythms of the range quickly. Garrett Hayes typically arrived around 7 a.m., his routine as precise as his shooting. He would spend exactly 15 minutes checking weather conditions, consulting his ballistic computer, and reviewing his shooting log from the previous session. Adrian Walsh preferred the late morning hours, claiming the lighting conditions were more consistent for her style of shooting.
Between them, they commanded the attention of nearly everyone on the range. Riley watched it all from her peripheral position, collecting spent brass while the drama of competition and ego played out around her. Connor Morrison had become a regular fixture, along with his shooting partner Dylan Reed, both wealthy amateur competitors who seemed more interested in having the most expensive equipment than in developing actual skill. Their conversations invariably centered on their latest purchases and which gear might give them an edge over other shooters. "Did you see the new Schmidt & Bender scope Garrett's running?" Dylan asked one morning as Riley worked nearby, their conversation carrying clearly in the desert air. $28,000! Just for the optic! "Price doesn't matter when you're winning prize money like he is," Connor replied, adjusting his own expensive scope. "I heard his sponsorship deals are worth 6 figures annually now." Riley continued sorting brass, but her trained ear couldn't help analyzing the technical aspects of their discussion. They talked about equipment with the reverence most people reserved for religious artifacts, but their actual shooting technique showed fundamental flaws that no amount of expensive gear could compensate for. Connor's breathing was inconsistent, Dylan rushed his trigger pull, and neither understood proper wind reading at extended distances. Meanwhile, when Garrett or Adrienne shot, Riley found herself unconsciously studying their technique with professional interest. Garrett's position was textbook perfect. Bone support, natural point of aim, consistent cheek weld. His shot process was methodical and repeatable, the kind of disciplined approach that won championships. Adrienne favored a slightly more aggressive style, but her fundamentals were equally solid. During her third week, Riley was replacing targets at the 2,000-meter line when she overheard a conversation that made her pause. Garrett and his coach, a grizzled former military sniper named Mitchell, were discussing an upcoming competition that would feature an extreme long-range challenge. "The Desert Precision Challenge is adding a 4,000-meter stage this year," Mitchell was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made impossible shots in places most people couldn't pronounce. Garrett nodded thoughtfully. "Wind reading becomes exponential at that range. Equipment limitations start showing up too. Even the best ballistic computers have trouble with all the variables." "It's not about the computer," Mitchell replied. "At 4,000 meters, it's about reading conditions the computer can't account for. Mirage patterns, thermal currents, atmospheric pressure changes. Old school stuff." Riley's hands stilled on the target frame she was replacing. 4,000 meters. She remembered the last time she'd attempted that distance, a qualification shoot that had determined her final military assignment. The memory was crisp. The weight of her rifle, the way the wind had shifted just as she had begun her trigger pull, the impossible arc of the bullet's flight path. "How many people do you think will even attempt it?" Garrett asked. "Maybe a dozen, but only 3 or 4 have any real chance of making a hit. Adrienne, obviously. You. Maybe that new guy from Texas with the custom Chaytak. Beyond that, it's prayer and luck." As Riley finished her work and moved on to the next target frame, she found herself calculating wind corrections and bullet drop in her head, mental exercises she hadn't performed in years. The muscle memory was still there, dormant but intact, like a language she'd once spoken fluently. Later that day, she was cleaning brass in her small work building when Adrienne Walsh stopped by. It was unusual. The elite shooters typically ignored Riley completely, treating her as part of the range infrastructure rather than a person. "You're the new maintenance girl, right?" Adrienne asked, though there was less condescension in her voice than Connor or Dylan typically displayed. "Riley Santos," she replied, looking up from her work. "Adrienne Walsh, you've been here a few weeks now." When Riley nodded, Adrienne continued. "You seem to know your way around the range pretty well. Ever done any shooting yourself?" Riley hesitated. "Some. Nothing like what you do here." Adrienne studied her for a moment, her competitive shooter's eye taking in details others missed. "Military?" "Army. But that was a while ago." "What kind of work?" "Infantry," Riley answered, using her standard deflection. Adrienne nodded, but her expression suggested she suspected there was more to the story. "Well, if you ever want to try the range, employee privileges include some practice time. Vincent's pretty reasonable about that kind of thing." After Adrienne left, Riley sat alone with her thoughts,
surrounded by thousands of spent brass casings that represented countless hours of practice and competition. Each piece of brass told a story, some from precision work at extreme distances, others from rapid-fire practice sessions, still others from the kind of casual shooting that wealthy hobbyists enjoyed. She picked up a .338 Lapua Magnum casing, turning it over in her fingers. This particular cartridge was designed for extreme long-range work, the kind of ammunition that cost more per round than most people spent on lunch. But Riley remembered when ammunition costs hadn't mattered, when accuracy was literally a matter of life and death, when missing wasn't an option. That evening, as she prepared to leave for the day, Riley found herself walking past the equipment storage area where various rifles were secured between sessions. Through the chain-link fencing, she could see the arsenal of precision instruments that represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in custom engineering. Each rifle was a masterpiece of metallurgy and precision manufacturing, designed to place bullets exactly where intended at distances that defied common sense. But standing there in the fading desert light, Riley knew something that the wealthy competitors and equipment-obsessed hobbyists didn't understand. The most expensive rifle in the world was worthless without the knowledge, experience, and mental discipline to use it properly. She'd seen soldiers make impossible shots with basic equipment, and she'd seen amateur competitors miss easy targets despite having gear worth more than most people's houses. As she drove home in her battered pickup truck, Riley made a decision that surprised even her. Tomorrow, she would ask Vincent about those employee practice privileges that Adrian had mentioned, not because she wanted to compete or show off, but because some part of her needed to know if the skills were still there, dormant beneath years of deliberately ordinary living. She told herself it was just curiosity, just a way to stay connected to a world she'd once dominated. But deep down, Riley knew it was more than that. The range had awakened something in her that she thought was permanently buried, the part of her that had once been capable of things that seemed impossible to everyone else. The question now was whether she was ready to let that part of herself breathe again, even if it meant risking the careful anonymity she'd built around her new life.
The morning of the official announcement arrived with the kind of crystal-clear desert conditions that made long-range shooters salivate. Riley was conducting her usual brass collection when she noticed an unusual buzz of activity around the main building. More vehicles than normal filled the parking lot, and she could see people gathering in the conference room visible through the large windows. Vincent's voice crackled over the range's PA system around 10 a.m. "Attention all shooters and staff. Please gather at the main pavilion for an important announcement regarding this year's Desert Precision Challenge." Riley continued her work, assuming the announcement wouldn't concern a maintenance assistant, but curiosity got the better of her when she saw even the most elite shooters abandoning their practice sessions to attend. She parked her ATV near the back of the growing crowd, close enough to hear, but far enough away to remain inconspicuous. Vincent stood on a small platform, flanked by several people Riley didn't recognize, but who carried themselves with the authority of major sponsors or competition officials. The assembled crowd represented the cream of the precision shooting world: national champions, record holders, equipment manufacturers, and serious amateur competitors whose bank accounts allowed them to chase perfection at any cost. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vincent began, his voice carrying clearly across the pavilion, "this year's Desert Precision Challenge will feature something unprecedented in civilian competition shooting." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd. Garrett Hayes and Adrian Walsh stood near the front, their body language suggesting they already knew what was coming. Connor Morrison and Dylan Reed positioned themselves where they'd be visible to everyone, clearly hoping to be associated with whatever prestige announcement was coming. "For the first time in the event's history, we're introducing an extreme long-range challenge stage," Vincent continued. "Competitors who qualify through the standard precision stages will be eligible to attempt a 4,000-meter shot." The crowd erupted in excited conversation. Riley felt her pulse quicken despite her determination to remain detached. 4,000 meters was a distance that separated true precision marksmen from everyone else who merely thought they could shoot. "The rules are simple," Vincent said, raising his voice over the chatter. "One shot, cold bore, no sighters. Standard atmospheric conditions will be provided, but reading the actual conditions will be entirely up to the competitor. The target will be a 30-inch steel plate. Generous by precision standards, but at 4,000 meters, it represents an angular measurement that will challenge even our best shooters." Sterling Walsh, the range's technical director and Adrian's brother, stepped forward with additional details. "For those wondering about the ballistics, we're talking about a flight time of approximately 6.8 seconds for most cartridges suitable for this distance. The bullet will drop more than 600 feet during flight, and a 5-mile-per-hour crosswind error will result in a miss by several meters." Riley found herself automatically running calculations in her head, her old training asserting itself despite her best efforts to remain mentally disengaged. 6.8 seconds of flight time meant enormous opportunity for wind changes, thermal shifts, and atmospheric variables that could push even a perfectly aimed shot off target. "Entry fee for the Extreme Range Challenge is $500, Vincent announced, causing another stir in the crowd. "That covers range time, target setup, and official scoring. Given the complexity of the shot, we expect fewer than 20 attempts." Riley watched the crowd's reaction with professional interest. She could almost see the mental calculations happening. Who could afford the entry fee? Who had equipment capable of the shot? And most importantly, who had the confidence to attempt something that would very publicly reveal the limits of their ability? Garrett Hayes stepped forward. "What about equipment restrictions?" "Standard competition rules apply," Sterling replied. "Any cartridge suitable for the distance, any scope configuration, any support system that doesn't involve mechanical assistance for trigger pull. This is pure marksmanship, not equipment limitations." "When do we need to commit?" Adrian asked, her competitive nature clearly engaged. "Registration closes in 2 weeks. The challenge itself will be the final event of the competition weekend, weather permitting. We need consistent atmospheric conditions for fairness." As the crowd began to disperse, Riley heard fragments of excited conversation. Equipment discussions dominated: who had rifles capable of the accuracy needed, which ammunition manufacturers might sponsor attempts, what scope configurations would work best at such extreme range. 4,000 meters, I heard Connor Morrison saying to Dylan Reed. "I've got the equipment for it. New Chitac, ballistic computer with atmospheric monitoring. Might be worth the entry fee just for the experience." Dylan laughed nervously. $500 to miss a shot nobody expects you to make anyway? "I don't know, man. That's public humiliation money if you whiff it badly." "Only if you're worried about missing," Connor replied with the confidence of someone who'd never attempted anything genuinely difficult. Riley shook her head slightly and returned to her ATV. The conversation reminded her why she'd left competitive shooting behind. Too much ego, too much equipment worship, too little understanding of what actually mattered when the pressure was real.
But as she drove back to her work area, she couldn't shake the mental image of that 4,000-meter target. In her mind, she could see the ballistic arc, visualize the wind patterns that would affect bullet flight over such a distance, calculate the precise holdovers and windage corrections needed. It was like flexing a muscle she'd forgotten she had. The rest of the day passed slowly, with Riley's usual tasks feeling somehow mundane after the morning's announcement. She found herself pausing frequently, staring out toward the distant target markers, remembering shots she'd made at similar distances when such things had been part of her daily routine. That evening, as she prepared to leave, Vincent approached her near the parking lot. His expression was thoughtful, almost curious. "Riley," he said, "I noticed you stayed for the announcement this morning. Any interest in the competition world?" She hesitated, caught between her practiced deflection and a growing internal pressure she couldn't quite identify. "Just curious about what gets people so excited." Vincent nodded slowly. 4,000 meters isn't for everyone. Hell, it's not for most people who think they're precision shooters. Takes a special kind of background to even understand what's involved. Something in his tone suggested he suspected more about her past than she'd revealed. "It's an impressive challenge," she said carefully. "Indeed it is. You know, if you ever decide you want to try some shooting during your off hours, the employee privileges are real. Might be interesting to see what you can do." After Vincent left, Riley sat in her truck for several minutes, engine off, staring at the range facility in the gathering dusk. The Desert Precision Challenge was still weeks away, but she could feel something shifting inside her, a restlessness she hadn't experienced in years. She'd spent 2 years convincing herself that her old life was behind her, that she was content being invisible and unremarkable. But the announcement had awakened something she thought was safely buried. The part of her that had once thrived on impossible challenges, that had found purpose in achieving what others deemed impossible. As she finally started her truck and headed home, Riley found herself wondering what would happen if she stopped hiding from who she'd once been. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. But she also knew that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again.
3 days after the announcement, Riley found herself standing in the employee equipment room at 6 a.m. before any of the regular shooters arrived. Vincent had given her access as part of her maintenance duties, but this morning she had a different purpose entirely. Hidden among the rental rifles and basic training equipment was something she'd discovered during her first week, a rifle that most people would overlook entirely. It was an Olver Remington 700 in .308 Winchester, far from the exotic calibers and custom builds that dominated the range. The stock was plain synthetic, the barrel was factory standard, and the scope was a basic Leupold that might cost less than one of Garrett's scope rings. To anyone else, it would appear to be exactly what it was, a basic training rifle suitable for beginners and casual shooters. But Riley recognized quality when she saw it. The bore was pristine, the action was glass smooth, and someone had clearly spent time ensuring the rifle was properly bedded and zeroed. It reminded her of the weapons she'd trained with in the military, functional, reliable, and accurate enough for serious work if the person behind it knew what they were doing. She signed out the rifle using her employee privileges, along with a modest amount of .308 ammunition from the training supplies. Nothing exotic, standard 168 grain match rounds that any serious shooter would consider adequate but unremarkable. The kind of ammunition that wouldn't draw attention or suggest she was attempting anything beyond basic practice. Riley's plan was simple: arrive early, use the 800-meter range while it was empty, and see if 2 years of ordinary living had completely eroded skills that once defined her identity. She told herself it was just curiosity, just a way to scratch an itch that the 4,000-meter announcement had awakened. The morning air was still cool when she reached the 800-meter firing line. The range stretched out before her, target markers clearly visible in the clear desert air. 800 meters was a respectable distance for most civilian shooters, but it had once been a warm-up distance for Riley. If she couldn't hit consistently at 800, there was no point in even thinking about 4,000. She set up methodically, muscle memory guiding her through a routine she hadn't performed in years. Shooting mat positioned properly, rifle rest adjusted for height, ammunition laid out within easy reach. The familiar weight of the rifle felt both foreign and completely natural as she settled into a prone position behind it. Through the scope, the target looked exactly as she remembered, a standard precision shooting target with scoring rings that required genuine accuracy to hit consistently. Riley adjusted the parallax, checked her eye relief, and began her breathing routine. Old habits returned without conscious thought. Natural point of aim, bone support, consistent cheek weld. Her first shot felt strange. The recoil pattern was different from her military weapons, the trigger pull was heavier than she preferred, and the scope's reticle was simpler than the advanced systems she'd once used.
But when she checked the target through her spotting scope, she found a clean hole in the 9 ring. Not perfect, but far from embarrassing. The second shot went into the 10 ring. The third was another 9. By her 5th shot, Riley found herself settling into a rhythm that felt increasingly familiar. The rifle's limitations became clear. It would never be a sub-MOA precision instrument, but her fundamental skills were obviously intact. As she continued shooting, Riley became aware of voices approaching from the direction of the main building. She glanced at her watch and realized she'd been shooting for over an hour. The regular shooters would be arriving soon, and she had no desire to explain her presence on the firing line. She quickly packed up her equipment, policed her brass, and returned the rifle to the equipment room before anyone could ask questions. But as she resumed her normal maintenance duties, Riley couldn't stop thinking about how natural it had felt to be behind a rifle again. Later that morning, as she collected brass from Garrett's practice session, she overheard a conversation that made her pause. Garrett was talking with Mitchell, his coach, about equipment choices for the 4,000-meter challenge. The 338 Lapua gives us the best ballistic coefficient, but the 50 BMG has more energy downrange. Wind deflection becomes the critical factor at that distance. What about atmospheric conditions? I've been running computer models, but the variables get exponential beyond 3,000 meters. Mitchell shook his head. Computers can't account for everything. Thermal layers, pressure gradients, humidity changes. At 4,000 meters, you're reading conditions the machine doesn't even know exist. Riley continued her work, but she was mentally cataloging every detail of their conversation. They were discussing challenges she'd faced before, variables she'd learned to read through experience rather than technology. The 4,000-meter shot wasn't just about equipment or ballistic calculations. It was about understanding atmospheric conditions that changed by the minute and wind patterns that shifted with thermal currents. That afternoon, she found herself researching the competition online during her break. The Desert Precision Challenge had grown from a small regional event to one of the most prestigious civilian shooting competitions in the country. Past winners included Olympic shooters, military snipers, and equipment manufacturers' test teams. The addition of the 4,000-meter challenge had already generated international attention.
The entry deadline was 10 days away, and according to the online registration, 12 shooters had already committed to attempting the Extreme Range Challenge. Darrett Hayes was listed, as was Adrian Walsh. Several names Riley didn't recognize, but whose credentials suggested serious competition experience. The entry fee was listed prominently, $500. $500 represented nearly a month of groceries for Riley, or 2 months of her truck payment. It was serious money for someone living paycheck to paycheck, money she couldn't afford to waste on what others would inevitably see as a publicity stunt by the maintenance girl. But as she stared at the registration page, Riley found herself calculating more than just the financial cost. What would it mean to step out of the shadows she'd carefully constructed around her new life? What would happen when people started asking questions about her background that she'd spent 2 years avoiding? More importantly, what would happen if she missed? A public failure at 4,000 meters wouldn't just be embarrassing. It would be humiliating in front of people who already saw her as invisible and irrelevant. Connor and Dylan would have ammunition for months of condescending comments. Even Vincent and the other staff might lose respect for her. But there was another possibility, one that Riley barely allowed herself to consider. What if she didn't miss? What if the skills that had once set her apart were still there, dormant but intact? What if she could make a shot that would force everyone to reconsider their assumptions about the quiet woman who picked up their brace casings? That evening, Riley sat in her small apartment, staring at her laptop screen with the registration page still open. Her finger hovered over the submit button as she weighed possibilities that could change everything about her carefully ordinary life. The old Riley,
the one who had thrived on impossible challenges and found purpose in achieving what others deemed impossible, whispered that she should take the shot. The new Riley, the one who valued anonymity and safety above all else, argued for maintaining the status quo. $500, one shot, 4,000 meters. The decision felt like much more than a shooting competition entry. It felt like choosing between two completely different versions of herself.
Riley submitted her registration at 11:47 p.m. on the final day using a credit card that was dangerously close to its limit. She'd spent the previous week in a state of constant second-guessing, but ultimately the pull of the challenge had proven stronger than her fear of exposure. The confirmation email arrived within minutes, officially making her the 13th competitor registered for the Extreme Long Range Challenge. The competition weekend arrived with perfect shooting weather, clear skies, minimal wind, and stable atmospheric pressure. Riley arrived at the range early, ostensibly to help with event setup as part of her maintenance duties, but really to observe the competitors and their equipment without drawing attention to herself. The main parking lot had been transformed into something resembling a military staging area. Custom trailers housed precision rifles worth more than most people's houses. Support crews bustled around elaborate equipment setups that included ballistic computers, weather monitoring stations, and spotting scopes that could read bullet holes at distances that defied common sense. Garrett Hayes had arrived with what appeared to be a small army of support staff. His primary rifle for the 4,000-meter challenge was a custom-built .50 BMG that had cost more than Riley's annual salary. The scope alone, a German-made precision instrument with ballistic turrets and atmospheric compensation, carried a price tag that made her stomach clench. Adrienne Walsh's setup was slightly more modest but no less impressive. Her chosen rifle was a .338 Lapua Magnum with a carbon fiber barrel and a stock that had been custom-fitted to her exact body measurements. Her support team included a dedicated wind reader and a ballistic computer operator whose job was to provide real-time atmospheric calculations. Connor Morrison and Dylan Reed had arrived together, their equipment representing a small fortune in precision shooting technology. Connor's rifle was a .416 Barrett that looked more like a piece of artillery than a precision instrument. Dylan had chosen a .338 Norma Magnum with enough accessories bolted to it to stock a small gun store. Riley watched it all from her position near the equipment staging area, feeling increasingly out of place. When the time came for her to retrieve her own rifle from the employee equipment room, she would be carrying a basic 3.08 that most of these competitors wouldn't consider suitable for 800-meter work, let alone 4,000 meters. The competition format was straightforward but demanding. Competitors would first complete qualification stages at 1,000, 1,500, and 2,000 meters. Only those who achieved specified accuracy standards would advance to the 4,000-meter challenge. The qualification stages would eliminate the merely wealthy from the genuinely skilled. Vincent called the competitors together for the final briefing at 8 a.m. Riley hung back near the edge of the group, hoping to remain inconspicuous among the 13 participants. Weather conditions are ideal, Vincent announced, consulting a tablet loaded with atmospheric data. Temperature is 72 degrees, humidity at 23%, barometric pressure steady at 30.12 inches. Wind is variable but generally light, 3 to 7 miles per hour from the southwest. Sterling Walsh stepped forward with technical details. For the qualification stages, you'll have 2 shots at each distance. Best shot counts for scoring. Standards are 1,000 meters, 8 ring or better. 1,500 meters, 7 ring or better. 2,000 meters, 6 ring or better. Miss the standard at any distance and you're eliminated. A murmur of nervous conversation rippled through the group. These were demanding standards that would challenge even experienced competition shooters. The 4,000-meter challenge will be conducted this afternoon for qualified competitors. 1 shot, cold bore, no sighters. Target is a 30-inch steel plate. Hit anywhere on the plate and you've accomplished something fewer than 100 civilians have ever done. Riley noticed that several competitors were already making calculations on their ballistic computers, inputting atmospheric data, and discussing wind reading strategies with their support teams. The technological advantage gap between her basic setup and their sophisticated systems felt overwhelming. Competitors will shoot in order of registration, Sterling announced, reading from his tablet. First up, Garrett Hayes. Second, Adrienne Walsh.
Riley listened as he read through the list, her pulse quickening as her name approached. 13th, Riley Santos. She caught several curious glances from other competitors who didn't recognize the name. Connor Morrison looked around the group with obvious confusion, clearly wondering who Riley Santos might be among the assembled elite shooters. The first qualification stage began at 9 a.m. with competitors taking their positions at the 1,000-meter line. Riley watched from a distance as Garrett stepped up to the firing line with his custom .50 BMG. Even at the shorter qualification distance, his rifle looked absurdly overpowered, like using a Formula One car for a grocery store run. His first shot struck the 9 ring with authority, the massive bullet punching a hole that was visible even without magnification. His second shot was another 9, easily meeting the qualification standard. Polite applause rippled from the spectators who had gathered to watch the competition. Adrian followed with similar results, her .338 Lapua placing both shots in the 9 ring with the precision that had made her a world record holder. Connor Morrison managed 2 solid 8-ring hits, while Dylan Reed qualified with an 8 and a 9. When Riley's turn arrived, she felt the weight of curious stares as she approached the firing line carrying the basic Remington 700. Several spectators exchanged glances that clearly questioned how someone with such modest equipment had even qualified to compete.
She settled into position behind her rifle, acutely aware that her simple synthetic stock and basic scope looked primitive compared to the technological marvels the other competitors were using. But as she aligned her sight picture and began her breathing routine, the familiar calm of focused concentration settled over her. The first shot felt perfect, smooth trigger break, clean follow-through, recoil absorbed properly. Through her spotty scope, she could see a neat hole in the 10 ring. Her second shot was another 10, placing both bullets within inches of each other. A surprised murmur arose from the spectators. Riley heard someone behind her whisper, "Who is that?" But she ignored the attention, focusing instead on preparing for the next qualification stage. The 1,500-meter stage proved more challenging for several competitors. The increased distance revealed equipment limitations and shooter inconsistencies that the shorter range had hidden. 2 competitors were eliminated when their shots fell outside the required 7-ring standard. Riley's performance remained steady. 2 shots in the 9 ring that met the qualification standard with room to spare. She noticed Vincent watching her more intently now, his expression thoughtful and slightly puzzled. As the day progressed through the 2,000-meter qualification, the field narrowed to 8 competitors. Riley found herself among the survivors, along with Garrett, Adrian, Connor, and 4 other serious competitors whose equipment and experience marked them as legitimate threats. By afternoon, word had spread throughout the range about the mysterious competitor with the basic rifle who was shooting alongside the elite. A crowd began gathering for the 4,000-meter challenge, drawn by curiosity about what many considered an impossible shot. Riley stood at the edge of the group, her basic rifle slung over her shoulder, watching the elaborate preparations of her fellow competitors. In a few hours, she would either validate years of hidden expertise or publicly humiliate herself in front of people who would never let her forget the failure. Either way, there was no turning back now. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as the 8 qualified competitors gathered at the 4,000-meter firing line. What had started as a routine competition day had transformed into something approaching a spectacle. Word had spread beyond the immediate shooting community, and Riley counted at least 50 spectators positioned behind the firing line, including several people with professional cameras who appeared to be documenting the historic attempt. The target itself was barely visible to the naked eye, a 30-inch steel plate positioned so far downrange that it appeared as little more than a dark speck against the desert backdrop. Even through high-powered spotting scopes, it looked impossibly small and distant. Riley found herself calculating the angular measurement automatically. At 4,000 meters, the 30-inch target represented roughly 0.2 minutes of angle, a target that required absolute precision to hit. Vincent and Sterling had set up an elaborate scoring system, complete with remote cameras positioned near the target and acoustic sensors that would detect bullet impacts. A large monitor near the firing line would display real-time footage of the target area, allowing spectators to see results immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vincent announced through a portable PA system, "you're about to witness something truly extraordinary. The 4,000-meter precision shot represents the absolute pinnacle of civilian marksmanship. To put this in perspective, the bullet will travel for nearly 7 seconds, drop more than 600 feet during flight, and be affected by atmospheric conditions across nearly 2.5 miles of desert terrain." Riley felt her mouth go dry as the magnitude of what she was attempting truly sank in. In the military, she'd made shots at this distance, but always with extensive preparation, multiple sighters, and equipment specifically designed for extreme range work. Today, she would have one shot with a basic training rifle and ammunition that cost less per round than most competitors spent on cleaning patches. The shooting order would follow the qualification results, with the highest scorers going last. Riley had finished 4th overall in the qualification stages, putting her in the middle of the group. She would shoot after 4 other competitors, but before Adrian, Connor, and finally Garrett Hayes. The first competitor was a serious-looking man from Colorado who'd brought a custom .416 Barrett and enough support equipment to outfit a small military unit. His team spent 15 minutes taking atmospheric readings, consulting ballistic computers, and discussing wind patterns before he finally settled into position behind his rifle. The shot, when it came, sounded like a cannon blast that echoed across the desert. Through the monitor, spectators could see a dust cloud erupt several meters to the right of the target plate. A miss, but not by an embarrassing margin considering the distance involved. The second shooter, a woman from Texas with a .50 BMG, placed her shot closer, but still missed left by what appeared to be about 3 meters. Close enough to demonstrate genuine skill, but not close enough to count as a hit. The third competitor, shooting a .338 Lapua Magnum, actually struck the target frame, but missed the scoring plate by inches. The crowd erupted in appreciative applause. Hitting anything at 4,000 meters was an accomplishment worth celebrating. The fourth shooter missed entirely, his bullet impact invisible even to the remote cameras. Then it was Riley's turn. As she approached the firing line, the conversations behind her faded to whispers. She could feel the weight of curious stares as spectators tried to understand how someone with such basic equipment had made it this far in the competition. Her rifle, with its simple synthetic stock and modest scope, looked almost primitive compared to the technological marvels the other competitors were using. Riley set up methodically, laying out her shooting mat and adjusting her position with the careful precision of someone who'd done this countless times before. She had no support team, no ballistic computer, no wind-reading equipment beyond her own eyes and experience. Just her rifle, one carefully selected cartridge, and skills she'd spent years developing and 2 years trying to forget. She settled into position behind the rifle, feeling the familiar comfort of proper bone support and natural point of aim. Through her scope, the target was barely visible, a tiny dark shape that wavered slightly in the heat mirage rising from the desert floor. At this distance, even the best optics were limited by atmospheric conditions and the curvature of the Earth itself. Riley began her wind reading routine, a process she'd learned through years of experience and training that no computer could replicate. She watched the mirage patterns, studied the vegetation between her position and the target, observed the way dust moved in the distance. The wind was complex, multiple layers moving at different speeds and directions, creating a puzzle that required intuition as much as technical knowledge. She could feel the crowd's attention focused on her as she lay motionless behind her rifle, taking the time needed to read conditions properly. This wasn't a speed shooting competition. This was about making one perfect shot under conditions that challenged the limits of human and equipment capability. The ballistic calculation was complex, but manageable.
Her .308 Winchester cartridge would drop approximately 620 feet during its 6.8-second flight to the target. Wind deflection would be the critical factor. A 5-mile-per-hour error in wind reading would result in a miss by several meters. Riley made her final scope adjustments, dialing in the elevation and windage corrections based on her reading of conditions. She had no computer backup, no second opinion, no safety net beyond her own judgment and experience.
She settled into her final shooting position, placing her cheek against the stock with a consistent pressure that ensured repeatable scope alignment. Her breathing settled into the controlled rhythm that had once been as natural as walking. The crosshairs wavered slightly in the heat mirage, but Riley had learned long ago to read through atmospheric distortion. The trigger felt exactly as she remembered from her practice sessions, heavier than she preferred, but predictable and clean. She began the slow, steady pressure that would eventually break the shot, her entire world narrowing to the tiny target visible through her scope. The rifle thundered against her shoulder, the muzzle blast echoing across the desert as the bullet began its long arc toward a target that seemed impossibly far away. Riley held her position, watching through her scope as she'd been trained, calling her own shot based on where the crosshairs had been at the moment of trigger break. Then began the longest 6.8 seconds of her life. The bullet was invisible in flight, its path traceable only by ballistic calculation and hope. In the silence that followed the shot, Riley could hear her own heartbeat and the distant sound of the bullet's supersonic crack echoing off desert rocks. On the monitor displaying the target area, a small dust cloud appeared. For a moment, nobody was certain what they'd seen. Then the acoustic sensors confirmed what the cameras had recorded: metallic impact. The 30-inch steel plate rang like a bell as Riley's bullet struck dead center. The desert fell completely silent. Riley had just accomplished something that fewer than 50 people in the world had ever done: a confirmed hit at 4,000 meters with basic equipment and a single shot. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Riley remained in position behind her rifle, scope still trained on the distant target, hardly believing what she'd just accomplished. Through the remote camera feed, the impact point was clearly visible. A bright mark dead center on the 30-inch steel plate where her bullet had struck with devastating accuracy. Then, the desert erupted. "Holy shit!" someone shouted from the crowd, breaking the stunned silence. "She actually hit it!" Spectators surged forward, voices rising in excitement and disbelief. The acoustic sensors continued beeping, confirming what everyone had witnessed, but few could process. A perfect center hit at a distance that challenged the limits of civilian marksmanship capability. Riley slowly lifted her head from her rifle scope, her hands trembling slightly from adrenaline. She'd known the shot felt right when she'd broken the trigger, but knowing and confirming were two entirely different things. At 4,000 meters, even perfect shots could be defeated by atmospheric variables no human could predict. Vincent was the first to reach her, his expression a mixture of amazement and suspicion. "Riley," he said, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise, "that was extraordinary. Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" Before Riley could answer, Garrett Hayes appeared at her shoulder, his face showing a combination of respect and barely contained shock. The man who'd been considered the obvious favorite for the challenge had just watched someone with basic equipment accomplish what he'd been preparing months to attempt. "That's impossible," Garrett said, not with anger, but with the bewilderment of someone whose understanding of precision shooting had just been fundamentally challenged. A basic .308 at 4,000 meters with no ballistic computer, no wind reading equipment. "What's your background?" Riley slowly rose to her feet, acutely aware that she'd become the center of attention for every person on the range.
The careful anonymity she'd maintained for 2 years had just been completely destroyed by a single perfect shot. "Military," she said simply, using her standard deflection. "What kind of military?" Adrienne Walsh demanded, having abandoned her own preparation to witness the commotion. Her tone carried the sharp edge of a competitor who'd just realized she might not be the most skilled shooter present. Riley hesitated, looking around at the circle of faces surrounding her. Shooters, spectators, range staff, and competition officials all waited for an explanation that would make sense of what they'd just witnessed. She could see smartphones recording her, capturing this moment for social media posts that would spread far beyond the shooting community. "Military," she said, finally. "Special operations. Designated marksman training." The crowd's murmur intensified. Special operations carried weight in the shooting world. It implied training and experience that went far beyond what most civilian shooters ever encountered. "What unit?" Mitchell, Garrett's coach, asked with the directness of someone who'd served himself and knew the right questions to ask. Riley felt the walls of her carefully constructed new identity crumbling around her. These weren't casual questions from curious bystanders. These were serious inquiries from people who understood what her performance implied about her background. 75th Ranger Regiment, she said quietly. Later, specialized sniper training with Delta Force selection cadre. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The 75th Rangers commanded respect in any military discussion, but Delta Force sniper training represented the absolute elite of American military marksmanship. Only a handful of people each year were selected for such programs, and fewer still completed them successfully. Connor Morrison, who'd been preparing for his own shot, lowered his rifle and stared at Riley with dawning comprehension. "You're telling us you're a Delta-trained sniper who's been working here as maintenance staff?" "Former. I've been out for 2 years." "Why the hell are you picking up brass casings?" Dylan Reed asked with genuine confusion. Riley's jaw tightened. The question touched on everything she'd been running from. The reason she'd left the military, the medical discharge, the PTSD diagnosis that had ended a career she'd loved more than anything else in her life. "Because that's the job I could get," she said simply. Vincent stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Riley, when I asked about your background weeks ago, you said infantry. You never mentioned sniper training or special operations." "You didn't ask." Which was technically true, but obviously incomplete. Sterling Walsh, who had been monitoring the electronic scoring systems, approached with a tablet in his hands. "The shot data is remarkable," he announced to the crowd. "The impact velocity suggests the bullet was still supersonic at target, and the precision is, well, it's professional level. This isn't luck." The remaining competitors had gathered around, their own attempts temporarily forgotten in the face of what Riley had accomplished. Several were examining her rifle with barely concealed amazement, trying to understand how such basic equipment had produced such extraordinary results. "Can I see your rifle?" Garrett asked, with the respect of one professional addressing another. Riley nodded, stepping aside as Garrett examined the simple Remington 700. He worked the bolt, checked the scope mounting, and peered down the barrel with the thoroughness of someone looking for hidden modifications or custom work. "It's completely stock," he announced to the crowd. "Factory barrel, basic scope, standard trigger. She made a 4,000-meter center hit with a rifle that most people wouldn't consider suitable for 800-meter work." "What ammunition?" Adrienne asked.
Federal gold medal match, 168 grain, Riley replied. Nothing special. The specifications sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. The ammunition Riley had used cost less than $5 per round, while most extreme long-range shooters used custom-loaded cartridges that cost $20 or more per round. "How many times have you shot at 4,000 meters?" Mitchell asked. Riley considered the question carefully. Enough times to know it works. It was another deflection, but the truth was more complex than she was prepared to share.
During her military service, 4,000-meter shots had been part of advanced training scenarios and real-world operations that she couldn't discuss publicly. She'd made such shots under conditions far more challenging than today's controlled competition environment. A young reporter who'd been covering the competition pushed forward with a recording device. "Riley, this is an incredible story. A maintenance worker with military training making one of the longest confirmed precision shots in civilian competition history? Can you tell us more about your background?" Riley felt panic rising in her chest. Media attention was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid. Her carefully constructed quiet life was about to be blown apart by reporters and social media posts that would reach far beyond the shooting community. "I need some air," she said, stepping away from the crowd. But Vincent caught her arm gently. "Riley, you can't just walk away from this. What you just did, it changes things. People are going to have questions." She looked around at the faces surrounding her, some filled with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with the kind of predatory interest that came from people sensing a story worth exploiting. "I know," she said quietly. "That's what I was afraid of." The sound of another rifle shot echoed across the desert as the competition continued, but nobody was paying attention to the remaining attempts. Riley Santos, the invisible maintenance worker, had just become the center of attention in a world she'd been trying to leave behind. And there was no going back to anonymity now.
By the time the competition officially concluded, word of Riley's shot had spread far beyond Copper Canyon precision range. Social media posts featuring shaky phone videos of her perfect 4,000-meter hit were already going viral in shooting communities across the internet. The hashtag #MaintenanceSniper was trending on several platforms, accompanied by increasingly embellished versions of the story. Riley found herself reluctantly fielding questions from a growing crowd of spectators, competitors, and media representatives who'd arrived after news of the historic shot spread. She'd tried to retreat to her small maintenance building, but Vincent had gently insisted that she needed to participate in the award ceremony and official documentation of her achievement. The ceremony itself was surreal. Riley stood on a small platform beside Garrett Hayes, who'd managed a respectable near miss on his 4,000-meter attempt, and Adrienne Walsh, who'd placed her shot within 2 meters of the target, an impressive feat that would have been the day's headline under normal circumstances. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vincent announced to the assembled crowd, "today we witness something truly extraordinary. Riley Santos has achieved what many considered impossible, a center hit at 4,000 meters with basic equipment and a single shot. This represents not just exceptional marksmanship, but a demonstration of skills that very few people in the world possess." The crowd erupted in applause, but Riley noticed the quality of attention had changed completely from the morning's dismissive glances. Spectators who'd earlier questioned her presence among the elite competitors now watched her with obvious respect and curiosity. Garrett Hayes stepped forward to address the crowd. "I've been shooting competitively for 15 years, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "I've trained with Olympic champions, military snipers, and equipment manufacturers' test teams. What Riley accomplished today demonstrates a level of skill that goes beyond equipment, beyond technology, beyond what most of us will ever achieve. She's earned my complete respect." The statement carried enormous weight, coming from someone of Garrett's reputation. Adrienne Walsh nodded in agreement, adding, "The precision required for that shot, with that equipment, under these conditions, it's professional-level marksmanship. Military training clearly doesn't leave you." Connor Morrison and Dylan Reed approached after the ceremony, their earlier condescension replaced with genuine curiosity and respect. Connor, who'd spent the morning boasting about his expensive equipment, now seemed almost embarrassed by his earlier attitude. "Riley," Connor said, extending his hand, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your background and abilities that were completely wrong. That shot was incredible." Dylan nodded enthusiastically. "Could you maybe give us some tips about wind reading at extreme range? I mean,
if you're willing to share techniques. Riley found herself in the strange position of being asked for advice by shooters who hours earlier had treated her as invisible. The reversal was both gratifying and uncomfortable. She'd never sought recognition, only the satisfaction of knowing her skills remained intact. Wind reading at that distance is mostly about experience. You learn to see patterns that computers can't account for. Thermal layers, pressure gradients, how vegetation moves at different elevations. It takes time to develop. Mitchell, Garrett's coach, joined the conversation with the serious interest of someone who understood the technical implications of what he'd witnessed. The military training you mentioned, how long were you in sniper programs? Riley hesitated, still uncomfortable with the attention, but recognizing that complete evasion was no longer possible. 3 years in specialized marksmanship roles, different environments, different challenges. You learn to adapt to whatever conditions you face. Different environments meaning overseas deployments? Mitchell pressed gently. Some, Riley replied, her tone indicating that line of inquiry was closed. Vincent approached with several official-looking documents and a small trophy. Riley, we need to get your achievement properly documented. The National Precision Shooting Association wants to verify this as an official civilian record. Would you be willing to participate in their confirmation process? The idea of official record-keeping and national attention made Riley's stomach clench, but she nodded reluctantly. The shot had happened in front of dozens of witnesses with multiple camera angles. There was no hiding from the documentation now. As the afternoon progressed, Riley found herself at the center of increasingly serious conversations about her future in competitive shooting. Sponsors who'd never noticed her existence were suddenly expressing interest in supporting her equipment needs. Competition organizers were extending invitations to events she'd never imagined attending. You know, Adrian said during a quiet moment between interviews, there are opportunities in this sport for someone with your abilities. Sponsorships, training contracts, competition circuits. You could make a living doing what you're obviously exceptional at. Riley appreciated the suggestion, but the idea of returning to a world where shooting was the center of attention felt overwhelming after 2 years of deliberate anonymity. I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of visibility. Why not? Adrian asked with genuine curiosity. You've got skills that most of us spent our entire careers trying to develop. Why hide that?
The question touched on everything Riley had been wrestling with since leaving the military. The reasons she'd walked away from shooting weren't about ability, they were about the psychological cost of a career that had defined her identity so completely that losing it had nearly destroyed her.
It's complicated, Riley said finally. Adrian nodded with understanding. Military service can be, but what you did today, that's a gift. It seems like a waste to keep it hidden. As the sun began setting over the desert, Riley found herself alone for the first time since her shot. The crowd had dispersed, competitors had packed up their equipment, and the range had returned to its normal, quiet state. She sat on the bench near the firing line, looking out toward the distant target markers, trying to process everything that had changed in a single afternoon. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends who'd seen the social media posts, reporters requesting interviews, and shooting organizations extending invitations. The carefully controlled life she'd built over the past 2 years had been completely upended by 6.8 seconds of bullet flight. Vincent approached as she prepared to leave, his expression thoughtful. Riley, I want you to know that whatever you decide about your future, you'll always have a place here. But I also think you should consider what opportunities might be opening up for you now. What do you mean? She asked. I've been in this business for 20 years. I've seen a lot of exceptional shooters, but what you did today was special. The kind of performance that changes careers and opens doors. You could write your own ticket in the precision shooting world if you wanted to. Riley nodded, but her expression remained uncertain. I need some time to think about all this. Of course, but don't think too long.
opportunities like this don't come around often, and the shooting world has a short memory for anything except consistent performance. As Riley drove home in her battered pickup truck, she couldn't escape the reality that everything had changed. The anonymous maintenance worker who'd arrived at Copper Canyon weeks earlier no longer existed. In her place was someone the shooting world now recognized as possessing skills that very few people could match. The question now was what she would do with that recognition, and whether she was ready to step back into a world she had deliberately left behind.
The weeks following the Desert Precision Challenge transformed Riley's life in ways she couldn't have imagined. The video of her 4,000-meter shot had been viewed millions of times across various platforms, spawning countless reaction videos, technical analysis breakdowns, and heated debates about equipment versus skill in precision shooting. Major shooting publications had picked up the story, with American Rifleman featuring her on their cover under the headline, "The Maintenance Worker Who Shocked the Shooting World." The article delved into the technical aspects of her achievement, while respectfully handling her military background, focusing on the shooting accomplishment rather than classified operational details. Riley's phone rang constantly with opportunities she'd never considered possible. Rifle manufacturers wanted to sponsor her equipment needs, ammunition companies offered development contracts, competition organizers extended invitations to events around the world. The transformation from invisible maintenance worker to sought-after precision shooting talent had happened with stunning speed. Vincent had officially promoted her from maintenance assistant to range instructor, a position that came with better pay and the opportunity to share her expertise with serious shooters. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now teaching the same people who'd dismissed her just weeks earlier. Her first class included Connor Morrison and Dylan Reed, both of whom had specifically requested instruction after witnessing her performance. The dynamic was completely reversed from their initial condescending encounters. "Riley," Connor said during a wind reading lesson, "I've been shooting for 10 years, but watching you work that 4,000-meter shot made me realize how much I don't understand about atmospheric conditions." Riley found herself enjoying the teaching role more than she'd expected. Working with motivated students who genuinely wanted to improve reminded her of the positive aspects of her military training experience, the satisfaction of passing on hard-earned knowledge to people who would use it responsibly. "The key is learning to see layers," she explained to her class of advanced shooters. "Wind isn't uniform from firing point to target. At 2,000 meters, you might have 3 different wind patterns affecting bullet flight. At 4,000 meters, you could have 6 or 7 distinct atmospheric zones." Garrett Hayes had become an unexpected ally and friend. His initial shock at her performance had evolved into genuine respect and curiosity about her techniques. He'd started training alongside her, their sessions becoming collaborative rather than competitive. "Your approach to reading Mirage is completely different from anything I learned in civilian competition. It's like you're seeing atmospheric conditions the rest of us can't detect," Riley replied. "Military training emphasizes adaptation. We learn to shoot in conditions that would cancel civilian competitions. Sandstorms, extreme temperatures, atmospheric pressure changes. You develop instincts that go beyond what equipment can measure." Adrain Walsh had also become a regular training partner, drawn by Riley's unconventional techniques and proven results. Their sessions often attracted spectators who wanted to observe 2 world-class shooters pushing each other to higher levels of performance. "Your shot process is incredibly consistent," Adrain noted, after watching Riley place 5 consecutive shots within a 2-inch group at 1,500 meters. "Even under pressure, your fundamentals never waver." Riley appreciated the camaraderie but remained cautious about the attention. The shooting world's fascination with her story continued to generate media interest that made her uncomfortable. Reporters still called regularly, seeking details about her military service that she wasn't prepared to share. The psychological challenges of her transition back into shooting prominence were complex. Some days, being behind a rifle felt completely natural, like reconnecting with a fundamental part of her identity. Other days, the pressure and attention triggered anxiety that reminded her why she'd left competitive shooting behind. Dr. Sarah Chen, the VA counselor Riley had been working with since her discharge, helped her navigate the emotional complexity of her new situation.
It sounds like you're rediscovering parts of yourself that you thought were lost. That can be both healing and overwhelming, she observed during one of their sessions. I don't want to go back to defining myself entirely through shooting. That was part of the problem before. When my military career ended, I didn't know who I was without a rifle. But now you have the opportunity to choose how shooting fits into your life rather than having it define your entire identity, Dr. Sarah Chen suggested. The insight proved helpful as Riley began establishing boundaries around her new opportunities. She accepted some sponsorship deals, but declined others that would require extensive travel or media commitments. She agreed to compete in select events, but maintained her teaching responsibilities at Copper Canyon. 3 months after her famous shot, Riley found herself preparing for the International Precision Shooting Championship, her first major competition since leaving the military. The event would feature the world's best precision shooters, including several former military snipers whose reputations she'd known for years. The night before the competition, she sat in her small apartment cleaning the custom rifle that Accuracy International had built for her as part of her sponsorship agreement. The new equipment was extraordinary, precision machined components that represented the cutting edge of rifle technology.
But as she worked, Riley found herself thinking about the basic Remington 700 that had started this journey. That humble rifle, with its simple scope and standard ammunition, had been sufficient to accomplish something most people considered impossible. The lesson wasn't lost on her. Success came from the person behind the equipment, not the equipment itself. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Vincent. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that you've already proven everything you need to prove. Shoot your own race. Riley smiled at the advice. Vincent understood that she wasn't trying to validate herself to the shooting world. She was simply exploring how much of her old skills remained intact and whether she could find peace with the identity she'd tried to abandon. The transformation from anonymous maintenance worker to recognized precision shooting talent was complete. But Riley had learned to control the narrative rather than be controlled by it. She would compete on her own terms, teach students who genuinely wanted to learn, and maintain the emotional boundaries necessary to protect the progress she'd made in healing from her military transition. The woman who'd once picked up brass casings in anonymity had evolved into someone who could balance exceptional skill with personal well-being. It was a transformation that went far deeper than simple recognition. It was about reclaiming parts of herself she'd thought were permanently lost, while maintaining the wisdom to prevent those parts from consuming her entire identity again. Tomorrow's competition would be another test, but Riley approached it with the confidence that came from knowing who she was both with and without a rifle in her hands.
1 year after the shot that changed everything, Riley stood at the same 4,000-meter firing line where her anonymous life had ended and her public recognition had begun. Copper Canyon Precision Range was hosting the inaugural Riley Santos Memorial Challenge, named not because she had died, but because the event commemorated the death of assumptions about hidden talent and overlooked potential. The irony of having a competition named after her while she was very much alive wasn't lost on Riley. Vincent had suggested the name as a way to honor what her achievement represented, the idea that extraordinary ability could exist anywhere, hidden beneath ordinary circumstances, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The competition had drawn precision shooters from around the world, including several former military snipers who'd heard her story and wanted to test themselves against the course that had launched her back into prominence. The event featured multiple distance challenges, but the centerpiece remained the 4,000-meter shot that fewer than a dozen civilians had ever successfully completed. Riley watched from the instruction tower as competitors prepared for their attempts. Her role had evolved from participant to mentor, though she occasionally competed when the challenge particularly interested her. The International Precision Shooting Championship she'd attended months earlier had resulted in a second-place finish. Impressive for someone returning to competition after years away, but more importantly, a performance that proved her Desert Precision Challenge success hadn't been luck. "Nervous about watching other people attempt your signature shot?" Garrett Hayes asked, joining her in the tower. He'd become both a close friend and training partner, their relationship having evolved from surprise competitor to mutual respect to genuine friendship. "It's not my shot," Riley replied, adjusting the spotting scope to better observe the current competitor's setup. "It's just a distance. What matters is whether people understand that the equipment isn't the limiting factor." Through the scope, she watched a wealthy amateur competitor from California struggling with his custom 50 BMG rifle that had cost more than most people's cars. His support team included a ballistic computer operator, a dedicated wind reader, and enough technological assistance to launch a space mission. Despite all the advantages, his practice shots at shorter distances revealed fundamental technique flaws that no amount of equipment could overcome. "He's fighting his natural point of aim," Riley observed, offering commentary to the small group of advanced shooters who'd gathered to watch. "All that expensive gear can't compensate for inconsistent positioning." The shot, when it came, missed the target by nearly 50 meters, an expensive demonstration of the principle Riley had been teaching since her famous achievement. In contrast, the next competitor was a young Marine Corps veteran named Jessica Chen, who'd driven 18 hours from Colorado in a beat-up sedan. Her equipment was modest, a basic precision rifle in .308 Winchester that she'd assembled herself from quality but affordable components. Her approach reminded Riley of her own preparation a year earlier: methodical, focused, relying on fundamental skills rather than technological assistance. Jessica's shot struck the target frame, missing the scoring plate by less than 2 meters, a remarkable achievement for someone attempting the distance for the first time. "Now that's proper technique," Riley said, leading the applause from the observation tower. She made a mental note to offer Jessica some advanced training if she was interested. Later that afternoon, during a break between competition stages, Riley found herself walking the range grounds with Vincent, reflecting on how much had changed since her first day as a maintenance assistant. "Do you ever regret taking that shot? Your life was certainly simpler when you were invisible." Riley considered the question carefully. The past year had brought opportunities she'd never imagined, but also pressures and attention that sometimes felt overwhelming. The media interest eventually calmed down, but she still received interview requests and social media attention that reminded her how public her achievement had become. "I regret the anonymity sometimes, but I don't regret discovering that the skills were still there. For 2 years, I wondered if I'd lost something fundamental about myself when I left the military. That shot proved I hadn't." "What about the teaching? You seem to genuinely enjoy working with serious students." Riley smiled, thinking about the advanced classes she now taught regularly. Working with motivated shooters who wanted to push their limits reminded her of the positive aspects of her military training experience, the satisfaction of sharing hard-earned knowledge with people who would use it responsibly. Teaching is different from competing. It's about helping other people discover their potential rather than proving my own abilities. I like that balance. They paused near the memorial wall that honored military veterans who'd contributed to the sport of precision shooting. Riley's name had been added to the display, along with a photo from the Desert Precision Challenge and a brief description of her achievement. "Your story has inspired a lot of people," Vincent observed, "not just shooters, but anyone who's felt overlooked or underestimated. The number of veterans who've contacted us about training programs has tripled since your shot went viral."
Riley found that aspect of her recognition most meaningful. She'd received hundreds of messages from military veterans struggling with their transition to civilian life, many expressing how her story had encouraged them to pursue opportunities they'd previously considered beyond their reach. "If it helps other people recognize their own potential, then the attention was worth it," she said. As the day's competition concluded, Riley addressed the assembled competitors from the awards platform, a responsibility she'd grown more comfortable with over time. "When I made that 4,000-meter shot a year ago," she began, "it wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about discovering whether skills I'd developed years earlier were still intact. What I learned is that ability doesn't disappear just because circumstances change." She paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd, competitors, spectators, students, and fellow veterans who'd been drawn to the event by curiosity about the maintenance worker who'd shocked the shooting world. The most important lesson isn't about shooting technique or equipment selection.
It's about recognizing that extraordinary capability can exist in ordinary circumstances. Every person here has potential they haven't fully explored. Sometimes it takes the right challenge, the right moment, or just the courage to attempt something that seems impossible. The applause was warm and sustained, but Riley found herself thinking about the broader implications of her journey. Her transformation from invisible maintenance worker to recognized precision shooting instructor had become a story that resonated far beyond the shooting community. As the crowd dispersed and the range returned to its normal, quiet state, Riley remained on the platform for a moment, looking out toward the distant 4,000-meter target that had changed her life. The steel plate was barely visible in the desert heat shimmer, a tiny speck that represented the distance between who she'd been and who she'd become. The shot that had silenced the range had ultimately given her back her voice, not as someone seeking validation, but as someone who'd learned to balance exceptional ability with personal well-being. She'd discovered that recognition didn't have to mean losing herself in others' expectations, and that extraordinary skills could coexist with an ordinary desire for peace and purpose. The maintenance worker who'd once picked up brass casings in anonymity was gone forever, but the woman who'd emerged in her place had found something more valuable than recognition: the knowledge that she could be exceptional without sacrificing the hard-won wisdom that had carried her through her darkest period. Riley Santos had learned that sometimes the most important shot isn't the one that hits the target, it's the one that reminds you who you really are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.